The silence didn't announce itself. It just stopped filling the space where connection used to be. There's a specific type of distance that doesn't arrive through conflict. It arrives through repetition, through small, unacknowledged withdrawals that accumulate until the relationship no longer feels like what it was. This isn't about dramatic endings or clear betrayals. It's about the quiet erosion of presence, the kind that happens beneath conversation, beneath explanation, beneath anything that could be named or confronted directly. Relationship psychology operates on patterns, not on isolated moments. And when those patterns shift from reciprocal to one-sided, from present to absent, the emotional behavior that follows isn't irrational. It's responsive. What we're examining here isn't a person. It's a structure. The way emotional distance builds when contact stops without reason. The way attachment patterns react to sustained ambiguity. The way the mind tries to restore coherence when the psychological dynamics it relied on have quietly dissolved. This is behavior analysis applied to something most people experience but few understand in real time: the fracturing of an internal timeline. The moment when someone who was once reliably present becomes unpredictably absent, and the nervous system begins processing that absence as data. Most people notice the effects before they notice the cause. The distraction, the overthinking, the way certain silences feel heavier than others. These aren't signs of weakness or attachment issues in the pathological sense. They're signs that the emotional withdrawal on the other side has been registered, even if it hasn't been named yet. Relationship patterns don't lie. They reveal themselves through consistency, through what someone does repeatedly, not what they say occasionally. And when what someone does repeatedly is create distance, the relationship dynamics shift accordingly, whether or not that shift is ever discussed. This isn't about fixing anything. It's not about getting someone back or understanding their motives or learning techniques to close the gap they created. It's about understanding what happens internally when external connection fractures. It's about recognizing that clarity doesn't always come from the other person. Sometimes it comes from observing the pattern long enough to see it for what it is. And sometimes that's the only closure available. The kind you give yourself when the person who created the distance never explains why they left. There's a specific moment when communication shifts from present to absent, and the mind doesn't register it as an event. It registers it as a distortion. Time inside the relationship begins to operate differently than time outside of it. What used to feel fluid, natural exchanges, predictable rhythms, suddenly fragments into waiting, rereading, wondering. The emotional timeline no longer matches the calendar. Days stretch, hours compress. The attachment patterns that once created stability now generate a quiet, persistent unease that has no clear source. This isn't about missing someone. It's about the collapse of a shared temporal structure. Relationship psychology operates on rhythm, and when that rhythm is broken without explanation, the nervous system continues to expect the old beat. The silence that follows doesn't feel like silence. It feels like suspension. The behavior analysis here is simple. When contact stops, the internal clock doesn't stop with it. It keeps ticking, but now it's measuring emptiness. And emptiness, when stretched across emotional distance, becomes a form of data. Most people don't notice the fracture immediately. They notice the effects first: distraction, checking patterns, the urge to reach out without reason. These aren't signs of weakness. They're signs that psychological dynamics have shifted beneath the surface. The mind is attempting to restore continuity where continuity no longer exists. Emotional behavior doesn't always correlate with logic. It correlates with pattern recognition. And when a pattern breaks, the system tries to repair it, even when the other person has already moved on. What makes this stage dangerous isn't the silence itself. It's the cognitive loop it creates. The absence becomes the focal point. Attention narrows. Other relationship patterns fade into background noise. The person begins to exist more vividly in memory than they do in reality. This is where emotional withdrawal starts, not as a choice, but as a response to the void left behind. The internal timeline fractures, and with it, the ability to assess the present moment clearly. Something unspoken has already begun. The first silence might have felt accidental. The second one, coincidental. By the third, something shifts in perception. Repetition transforms randomness into pattern, and the mind begins cataloging these gaps without conscious effort. Each silence carries a slightly different weight, but together they form a sequence. The emotional behavior that once felt spontaneous now feels measured, withheld. What was fluid becomes punctuated. The pauses don't announce themselves. They accumulate quietly, and by the time they're noticed, they've already altered the relationship dynamics in ways that can't be undone. This is where attachment patterns start to reveal themselves under pressure. Someone securely attached might inquire directly. Someone anxiously attached might fill the gaps with interpretation. Someone avoidant might mirror the distance without realizing it. But regardless of style, the repetition itself becomes the message. Silence, when it recurs, is no longer neutral. It's a form of communication that operates below language. Behavior analysis in relationships hinges on this. What someone doesn't do is often more telling than what they do. The absence of contact, repeated across days or weeks, is not the absence of information. It's information in its rawest form. The emotional distance created by these gaps is incremental. It doesn't announce itself with conflict or confrontation. It builds in the spaces between messages, in the hours that stretch without explanation, in the gradual erosion of spontaneity. The person on the receiving end begins to adjust. They pull back slightly, test the waters less, recalibrate their expectations. This isn't conscious strategy. It's psychological dynamics at work. The nervous system learns what's no longer safe to expect. And once that learning occurs, the relationship has already shifted, even if neither party has acknowledged it yet. What makes this stage deceptive is that nothing catastrophic has happened. There's no argument to point to, no clear betrayal. Just a series of small withdrawals that, when viewed individually, seem forgivable. But relationship psychology doesn't operate on isolated incidents. It operates on cumulative weight. Each repeated silence adds another layer of doubt, another question mark, another moment where presence was expected, and absence arrived instead. The emotional flow between two people is delicate. Once it's interrupted repeatedly, it doesn't simply resume. It hesitates. And hesitation, in emotional terms, is the beginning of something else entirely. At some point, the explanation shifts. What once seemed tied to external circumstances, busy schedules, bad timing, stress, begins to feel like something internal, something chosen. The mind stops accepting randomness as justification and starts detecting structure. This is the moment when emotional behavior moves from ambiguous to interpretable. The silence is no longer just silence. It's a repeating variable. The relationship patterns that seemed inconsistent now reveal themselves as consistent in their inconsistency. And once that recognition settles in, the psychological dynamics change completely. This transition happens quietly. There's no announcement, no confrontation that forces clarity. Instead, there's a slow, internal realization that the gaps aren't accidents. They're tendencies. Behavioral patterns don't lie. They repeat because they reflect something deeper. Preference, avoidance, priority. The person who once responded quickly now responds slowly, or not at all. The person who used to initiate has stopped initiating. The absence becomes predictable, and predictability in this context is damning. Because once absence is patterned, it's no longer something that happens to the relationship. It's something the relationship has become. Attachment patterns respond to this shift with varying degrees of intensity. For some, the realization triggers pursuit, an attempt to restore what was lost through increased effort. For others, it triggers withdrawal, a protective recalibration that mirrors the distance being received. But the underlying mechanism is the same. The nervous system has detected a threat to connection and is responding accordingly. Emotional distance, when it becomes patterned, is no longer just a feeling. It's a signal, and signals, once received, demand response. The question isn't whether the relationship has changed. The question is whether anyone will acknowledge it. What's unsettling about this stage isn't the absence itself. It's the clarity that comes with it. The mind, having gathered enough data, begins to form conclusions without needing external validation. This is where behavior analysis becomes internal rather than relational. The focus shifts from "what are they doing" to "what does this mean?" And once that shift occurs, the relationship is no longer being experienced in real time. It's being reconstructed in hindsight, examined for clues, patterns, micro-behaviors that were missed earlier. The emotional withdrawal isn't a choice at this point. It's a natural consequence of trying to make sense of something that no longer makes sense. In the beginning, the pauses felt neutral. A day without contact didn't register as significant. A delayed response seemed reasonable. There was no reason to question it because the foundation still felt solid. Relationship psychology operates on trust until that trust is tested, and early silences rarely feel like tests. They feel like life. Normal. Expected. The emotional behavior between two people doesn't demand constant contact to remain intact. It relies on the assumption that contact will resume naturally. And for a while, it does. This is where the fracture begins, but it's invisible at the time. The first few pauses carry no weight because they're interpreted through the lens of connection, not distance. The mind fills in the gaps with generosity. They're busy. They'll reach out later. It's not a big deal. These aren't rationalizations yet. They're just the default settings of someone still operating from a place of psychological security. Attachment patterns haven't been activated yet. The silence is still just silence. It hasn't yet become a message. But something subtle happens during these early pauses that won't be understood until much later. The emotional distance isn't created by the pause itself. It's created by the lack of repair after the pause. If contact resumes naturally, the gap closes. If it resumes with hesitation, or if it doesn't resume at all, the gap widens. Behavior analysis doesn't focus on isolated moments. It focuses on what follows. The pause is only meaningful in retrospect, when the pattern it belonged to becomes visible. At the time, It's easy to dismiss, easy to forgive, easy to move past without noticing that something foundational has quietly shifted. What makes this stage so difficult to identify is that nothing has broken yet. The relationship dynamics still appear functional. There's no conflict, no obvious withdrawal, no reason to question what's happening. But beneath the surface, a quiet recalibration is already underway. The mind is beginning to store these pauses as data points, even if it's not consciously aware of it yet. And when enough data accumulates, the interpretation changes. What once felt temporary begins to feel intentional. What once carried no clear meaning begins to carry all of it. When the pauses continued, the mind didn't stop interpreting. It started interpreting harder. This is where psychological dynamics become most visible. In the gap between what's known and what's needed. The absence of clear communication doesn't create clarity. It creates a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. The mind generates explanations, narratives, justifications, anything to make sense of behavior that no longer aligns with expectation. These aren't delusions. They're attempts at coherence. Relationship psychology doesn't tolerate ambiguity well. It needs structure, and when structure isn't provided externally, it gets constructed internally. Each explanation feels reasonable in isolation. They're overwhelmed. They need space. They're going through something. These aren't wrong necessarily, but they're incomplete. And incompleteness, when sustained, becomes a form of emotional labor. The person receiving the silence is doing the interpretive work for both people. They're filling in gaps, smoothing over inconsistencies, creating a version of the relationship that still makes sense. This is where emotional behavior shifts from reactive to compensatory. The absence isn't just being tolerated, it's being explained away. And every explanation that lands softly makes the next silence easier to absorb. But there's a cost to this process that isn't immediately visible. Each internal explanation requires energy. Each narrative constructed to preserve connection erodes the ability to see the relationship clearly. Attachment patterns begin to distort under the weight of sustained uncertainty. Someone who was once secure starts to question their perception. Someone already anxious begins to spiral. Someone avoidant detaches further. The behavior analysis here is straightforward. When someone has to work this hard to make sense of another person's absence, the relationship has already shifted from mutual to one-sided. And one-sided relationships don't last. They just take longer to collapse. What's most striking about this stage is that the explanations are often accurate on some level. The other person probably is busy, stressed, distracted. But that's not the issue. The issue is that those circumstances have become a reason to withdraw, rather than a reason to communicate. The emotional distance isn't caused by external factors, it's revealed by them. Relationship patterns under stress either tighten or loosen, and when they loosen without acknowledgement, the person left behind has no choice but to create their own meaning. And meaning, when self-generated in the absence of truth, is almost always too generous. At a certain point, the internal landscape becomes louder than the external one. The silence from the other person remains the same, but the emotional response to it grows. This isn't irrationality. It's the nervous system responding to prolonged ambiguity. Relationship psychology operates on feedback loops, and when feedback is absent, the system amplifies its own signals. What started as mild concern becomes anxiety. What felt like patience becomes frustration. What seemed like understanding becomes resentment. None of this requires new information. It requires the absence of it, sustained over time, until the emotional behavior becomes reactive in ways it wasn't before. This is where psychological dynamics shift from observational to self-contained. The other person's actions, or lack of actions, no longer need to change for the emotional response to escalate. The mind has already accumulated enough data to form conclusions, and those conclusions generate their own momentum. Attachment patterns, when stressed without resolution, don't stabilize. They intensify. Someone anxiously attached might reach out more, seeking reassurance that isn't coming. Someone avoidantly attached might shut down entirely, preemptively protecting against further disappointment. Either way, the emotional distance between what's felt and what's expressed continues to widen. What makes this stage difficult is that the intensity feels disproportionate, even to the person experiencing it. They know logically that nothing new has happened. The silence is the same silence it was a week ago, but the cumulative weight of that silence has grown. Behavior analysis reveals something critical here. Emotional reactions aren't triggered by single events. They're triggered by patterns. And when a pattern of absence is sustained without explanation, the emotional system stops waiting for clarity and starts generating its own. This is where relationship patterns begin to fracture under internal pressure, even if the external circumstances haven't shifted at all. The other person, if they're still present in any capacity, likely has no idea this is happening. They're operating from their own timeline, their own logic, their own set of priorities. But the person on the receiving end is operating from accumulation. Every unanswered message, every delay, every silence adds to a narrative that's being written in real time. And once that narrative reaches a certain density, it becomes nearly impossible to revise. The emotional withdrawal that follows isn't a decision. It's a protective response to prolonged uncertainty. The mind stops reaching outward and starts fortifying inward. And that shift, once it occurs, is rarely reversible. Eventually, the distance stops feeling like an interruption. It starts feeling like the baseline. This is one of the quietest and most dangerous shifts in relationship psychology. The moment when absence is no longer anomalous. It's just how things are now. The emotional behavior that once caused distress becomes familiar. The silence that used to trigger questions now triggers nothing. Not because it's been resolved, but because it's been absorbed. The psychological dynamics have adjusted. The nervous system has recalibrated. What was once distance has become the new proximity. This normalization doesn't happen through acceptance or understanding. It happens through exhaustion. The mind can only sustain high-alert emotional states for so long before it adapts. Attachment patterns, when repeatedly disappointed, don't hold their shape. They shift to protect the person experiencing them. Someone who was once anxiously attached might begin to detach. Someone who was secure might become guarded. The relationship patterns that defined the connection early on are no longer recognizable. They've been reshaped by the sustained absence of reciprocity, and the result is a relationship that exists more in name than in function. What's unsettling about this stage is that it can feel like peace. The emotional intensity fades, the constant questioning subsides. There's less internal conflict because there's less expectation. But this isn't resolution, it's resignation. Behavior analysis shows that when someone stops reacting to distance, it doesn't mean the distance has closed. it means they've stopped believing it will. The emotional distance between two people becomes a fixed feature rather than a problem to solve. And once that happens, the relationship has fundamentally changed, even if no one has said so out loud. The danger here is that both people might mistake this for stability. The person who withdrew might think the other person has adjusted well. The person who adjusted might think they've moved past it. But what's actually occurred is a quiet detachment that neither party has fully acknowledged. Relationship psychology doesn't allow for sustained distance without consequence. When distance normalizes, connection doesn't remain intact. It erodes slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day someone realizes they're in a relationship with someone they no longer feel close to. And by then, the foundation has already shifted too far to repair. There was no fight, no betrayal, no single event that could be pointed to as the moment everything changed. Instead, there was a slow, almost invisible erosion of reciprocity. What used to feel balanced, effort, attention, emotional investment, began to tilt. One person kept showing up. The other person started showing up less. And because it happened gradually, without confrontation or clarity, it was easy to miss. Relationship psychology thrives on balance, and when that balance is lost without acknowledgement, the psychological dynamics begin to operate from unequal ground. Reciprocity isn't about keeping score. It's about mutual investment, the sense that both people are moving toward each other rather than one person doing all the moving. When that mutuality fades, emotional behavior shifts in response. The person giving more starts to feel it. Not immediately, but over time. The messages they send aren't returned with the same energy. The plans they make aren't met with the same enthusiasm. The emotional labor they put in isn't reflected back. Behavior analysis here is simple. When one person is doing the majority of the relational work, the relationship has already become unsustainable. It's just a matter of how long before that becomes undeniable. What makes this stage particularly painful is the absence of a clear breaking point. There's nothing to confront because nothing overtly wrong has happened. The other person hasn't done anything malicious. They've just done less. And less is difficult to argue against because it's not dramatic. It's quiet. It's subtle. It's the kind of shift that attachment patterns pick up on long before the conscious mind does. The nervous system knows when it's not being met halfway. It knows when effort is no longer reciprocated. And once that knowing sets in, the relationship patterns begin to adjust accordingly, even if neither person is ready to admit it. The weakening of reciprocity doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself through accumulation. A missed call here, a short reply there, a plan that falls through without follow-up. Each instance is forgivable. But together, they form a picture of someone who is no longer fully present. And the person on the other side of that absence is left in a difficult position. They can keep giving, hoping things will return to how they were, or they can begin to pull back, protecting themselves from the growing emotional distance. Either way, the relationship has already shifted. Reciprocity, once lost, is one of the hardest things to rebuild. And when it's lost without acknowledgement, it's almost impossible. By this point, the patterns are undeniable. Not because they've become more extreme, but because they've repeated enough times to form a recognizable shape. The mind, which once gave the benefit of the doubt, has gathered sufficient data. The emotional behavior that seemed inconsistent now reveals itself as consistent in its avoidance. The relationship dynamics that felt confusing now feel clear. This is the moment when psychological dynamics shift from interpretation to recognition. The pattern isn't something that needs to be proven anymore. It's something that's simply been observed too many times to ignore. This stage isn't characterized by drama or confrontation. It's characterized by quiet clarity. The person who's been on the receiving end of the distance stops making excuses for it. They stop reframing it as temporary or circumstantial. They stop waiting for it to change. Behavior analysis has done its work, not through conscious effort, but through repeated exposure to the same dynamic. The silence, the withdrawal, the lack of reciprocity, all of it has formed a clear, undeniable picture. And once that picture is seen, it can't be unseen. The attachment patterns that once tried to preserve the connection now shift towards self-protection. What makes this moment significant is that it requires no external validation. The other person doesn't need to admit anything. They don't need to explain their behavior or acknowledge the distance they've created. The person experiencing the pattern has enough information on their own. Relationship psychology doesn't require mutual agreement to assess reality. It requires observation. And when the observations all point in the same direction, the conclusion becomes inescapable. The relationship patterns have shown what words haven't said. And that, more than anything spoken, is what shifts the internal landscape. This is where emotional distance becomes not just something felt, but something known. The clarity is uncomfortable because it removes ambiguity. There's no more maybe or what if. There's just what is. And what is, in this case, is a relationship where one person has quietly stepped back without ever saying so. The psychological dynamics have reached a point where the person left behind has to make a choice. Continue waiting for something that isn't coming, or begin to move forward with the information they already have. The pattern has spoken. The only question left is whether they're ready to listen. The final shift happens entirely within. There's no conversation that brings closure. No apology that explains the distance. No moment of mutual understanding that ties everything together. Instead, there's a quiet, internal realization that settles in with a weight that feels both heavy and freeing. The person who's been trying to make sense of the absence finally stops trying. Not because they've given up, but because they've understood. Relationship psychology doesn't always provide neat endings. Sometimes clarity comes from recognizing that the absence of answers is, in itself, the answer. This is where emotional behavior reaches a point of resolution without needing the other person's participation. The mind has processed the pattern, absorbed the data, and arrived at a conclusion that doesn't require external validation. Attachment patterns, which have been activated and stressed throughout the entire process, begin to settle into acceptance. Not acceptance of the relationship as it is, but acceptance of the reality that it isn't what it once was. The psychological dynamics have shifted from hoping for change to understanding that change isn't coming. And with that understanding comes a quiet kind of power. What's striking about this stage is that it often feels like relief. Not the kind of relief that comes from resolution, but the kind that comes from no longer fighting against what's already true. The emotional distance that once caused distress becomes something that simply is. Behavior analysis has done its work. The patterns have been observed, cataloged, understood. And now, with that understanding, the person is free to make a choice that isn't reactive or desperate or confused. They can choose to stay, knowing exactly what they're staying in. Or they can choose to leave, knowing exactly what they're leaving behind. Either way, The choice is informed by clarity, not by hope or denial. Internal clarity, when it arrives without external confirmation, carries a specific kind of finality. It doesn't require the other person to acknowledge what happened. It doesn't require them to explain or apologize or change. It simply requires the person experiencing it to trust their own observation. And when that trust is fully present, the relationship, whatever form it's taken, has already been redefined. The fracture that began when contact stopped has completed its course. The internal timeline, which lost its continuity so long ago, has found a new one. And that new timeline no longer includes waiting for someone who stopped showing up a long time ago. The internal timeline fractured the moment contact stopped, but the recognition of that fracture took longer. It moved through stages: confusion, explanation, adjustment, clarity. Each stage felt distinct at the time, but looking back, they were all part of the same psychological process. The slow understanding that absence, when repeated without acknowledgement, is not neutral. It's a message. And the message, once fully received, changes everything. Relationship psychology doesn't offer clean resolutions. It offers awareness. And awareness, even when it arrives alone, is enough to move forward from. What happened wasn't about you misreading the situation. It was about you reading it correctly, over time, through behavior rather than words. The patterns revealed what the silence wouldn't say. The emotional distance became undeniable not because it intensified, but because it remained. And once you stop waiting for someone to confirm what you already know, the clarity that emerges is yours to keep. It doesn't need their participation. It doesn't need their understanding. It simply is. There's no instruction here on what to do next. No strategy for reconnection. No framework for closure. Just the recognition that when someone quietly steps back, the relationship has already redefined itself. The only question is whether you're willing to see it. And if you've made it this far, you already have. If you're watching this, you've likely felt the fracture. But here's what most people miss. The fracture didn't start when contact stopped. It started earlier. When communication didn't stop, it quietly thinned. That's the video you need to watch next. Because understanding when the distance began is just as important as recognizing when it became undeniable. The pattern didn't appear out of nowhere. It built slowly, beneath the surface, in ways you probably didn't notice at the time. But now you will. Go watch When Communication Didn't Stop. It quietly thinned. It's the piece that comes before this one. The piece that explains how relationships shift long before they break. You'll see the early signs you missed. The micro behaviors that signaled withdrawal before the silence ever arrived. And once you see those, the entire timeline will make sense in a way it didn't before. Don't skip it. It's not optional if you want the full picture. And if this resonated, subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel doesn't do surface-level advice. It does pattern recognition, psychological clarity, the kind of understanding that only comes from looking at relationship dynamics the way they actually operate, not the way we wish they did. Stay if you're ready to see it.